Zoe Marks is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she is on the board of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, core faculty at the Carr Center for Human Rights, and on the executive committee of Harvard Center for African Studies. Her research and teaching focus on conflict and political violence, peace building and social movements, and racism and gender inequality. Professor Marks holds a doctorate in politics and a master's degree in African Studies from the University of Oxford, as well as a BA in Government and African American Studies from Georgetown University. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, she was a Chancellor's Fellow and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, where she directed the master's program in African Studies and was director of the university's Global Development Academy. Teddy Svoronos is a lecturer at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and is the faculty director of training at Evidence for Policy Design. He teaches courses in statistics and econometrics for both MPP and MPA ID students and develops new digital and online teaching materials for the MPP program. In addition, Teddy has produced and taught several online modules for the Building Capacity to Use Research Evidence, known as BCURE project, which have been used in India and Pakistan with the aim of enabling policymakers to effectively use evidence in decision-making. A graduate of the Harvard PhD program in health policy, Teddy's dissertation focused on the extent to which quasi-experimental designs can approximate the results of randomized trials. He has also conducted research on healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on the interaction between patient behavior and access to health services. Zoe and Teddy, thank you so much for joining us today on this important topic. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Erica. Zoe, hello, how are you?
Hi, Teddy, I'm great. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Me too, thank you. I'm doing great. I'm very excited as well. Thank you everyone for attending. Our apologies for delaying this by a little bit. I hope that the reschedule wasn't too bad. Before we get started, just a quick note. We're saving questions and answers for the last sort of third or so of this webinar. That said, as questions come in, as they come to mind, please use the Q&A function in Zoom so that we can start to aggregate them and have access to them for once Q&A starts. So don't hesitate to ask questions, even though we're not going to address them for a little bit of time. Before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the background of some of the folks that are here with us. So we sent out a survey asking for folks' interests and background. And when it comes to the kinds of evidence and data that you all use in your work, there's really an enormous variety of them. So here's just sort of a subset of the ones that we got. All kinds of evidence and all kinds of data coming from National Bureaus of Statistics to qualitative interviewing to organizational feedback and feedback surveys, things along those lines. There's an enormous amount of data that we have access to, and the questions of equity and addressing issues of inequity, I think, really force us to rely on, I think, quite a few of these different types of data. About 60% of you said that you work either somewhat or indirectly on equity, so only 40% work on equity specifically. I think that's actually a really good mix for the kinds of conversations that we're planning to have. But I think it's worth noting that there is really kind of a wide variety of backgrounds that y'all are coming to this with. And I want to keep that in mind for when we go through our sort of framework for thinking about these questions.
All right, so Teddy, let's get started with why we're doing this. Why does evidence for equity and sort of both sides of that equation matter for you?
Sure. So, and I want to ask this to you as well. As they noted in my bio, my main interest is in training civil servants, training folks around the world to use data and evidence more effectively in policymaking. And the reason why I'm particularly concerned about questions of equity is that I think in conversations with equity, questions of data quality, of bias in the data, of being misled by data comes up a lot for a lot of the reasons that we're actually going to talk about today. But my concern is that a lot of the time, the response to realizing that there's a lot of problematic parts of data is to say, well, we can just say whatever we want. Let's forget about actually trying to think about things empirically. Let's just go with what we think is right. And I think that's a really slippery slope and a really dangerous way to go, particularly because I think you can really go both ways if you decide to just go entirely based on what your gut tells you. Rather, my hope is to get us to think more carefully about what data can tell us and not tell us, how to address issues of bias that we're going to talk about today. Those are the kinds of things that I think will make progress on questions of inequity and inequality a lot more palpable. And so my hope is that us talking about this will get us closer to that reality. What about you, Zoe?
Awesome. Well, I agree with a lot of what you said. I want to share for those who are joining us in the conversation today. I actually started as a researcher using qualitative data, and I've now kind of expanded my toolkit to use a lot of mixed methods. But I think there are really important reasons to be cognizant of the whole range of data. We're going to focus a bit more on the quantitative aspect of things and statistics because they do have that power, as Teddy said, to sort of obfuscate or reveal if you know how to use them responsibly and see through them. But more generally for me, I think this is so important because data and knowledge historically have been used to really kind of shore up power and build institutions. And they often exclude or obscure those sites of inequality that we're so interested in kind of addressing today. And so I want to use data and knowledge in its full context and, as well in the kind of statistical realm to put equity back in and to kind of begin closing some of those gaps, those blind spots where the tools that we have at our disposal have actually been used to cause harm or to in some ways erase or silence or obscure the nature of the problems that really matter. So I think that sharing these tools, having this conversation today, it expands, all of the ways that we can think about innovating with evidence for equity solutions. And this is just one piece of the puzzle, and we hope that there's a lot more to follow.
Great.
All right, so in addition to collecting a little bit of information about how many of you work on equity issues directly or indirectly, and at least some of you don't work on equity at all, and I think this is really going to speak to ways that you can integrate equity thinking into the work that you are otherwise doing, we also ask for questions. And so I want to share this question that came in, which is 3 parts. What are the best types of data and evidence to use to show that social, economic, and political inequality exist? How do we show exactly where these inequalities exist to inform the allocation of resources and development, for example, of policies? And then how do we measure change once the interventions are applied for addressing inequalities? Now, I think we can think about this as, how do we describe or understand the nature of the problem? How do we narrow our understanding of the mechanisms behind the problem? And then finally, how do we think about not only changing it, but really trying to track, are we moving in the right direction? Are we doing the things that we need to make an impact? And then where we'll end today is thinking about, then we iterate and start over, right? So even if we're making progress, there's always going to be new forms of inequality that emerge.
Wonderful. So maybe we'll start by, and there's a couple of questions already in the Q&A, just distinguishing between equity and equality in your thinking.
Yeah, so this is a big one. I think we've got a couple of bullet points here to help us along the way if you want to advance them.
Sure.
Thanks, Teddy. So, the first thing is we really do want to be data-driven in making the world a better place. As Teddy mentioned, I'm here to also remind us that there are different kinds of data. We can talk about that in the Q&A. We don't just want to accept the numbers, but we want to scrutinize and improve them. So Teddy, you have more on this, right?
Absolutely. So I think thinking about this distinction between equity and equality and thinking about equity as a notion of equal outcomes and equality as a notion of equal treatment, that distinction I think we've talked about, I'm sure, quite a bit in public discourse and organizations and things like that. But sort of the first thing, and I think a theme that we're going to have in today's session, is to really think about which terms you care about, which values you care about, which metrics you care about, because defining those things, I think, can matter quite a bit. So the way that we're thinking about this, and in terms of how we're talking about this, we're using inequality to describe sort of the status quo and equity to describe the goal. The framework that we're going to use to talk about today, knowing that there are a million different ways we could try to cut this question, is a set of 5 principles that we hope that you can use when trying to assess questions of inequity and inequality. Our goal here is to sort of see if these questions are enough of interest to folks to want to expand this into a broader offering through executive education. So we're going to mostly focus on characterizing the problem and starting to touch on solutions in hopes of expanding on the solutions further down the road. So the main principles we have are know your population, examine your data distribution, take an intersectional approach, mind the data gap, and define equity and success carefully. So Zoe, why don't you start with know your population?
Great, thanks, Teddy. So in terms of knowing your population, the population really refers to the whole group of people, the households, all of the communities that you want to understand or draw conclusions about. And I think what's important here is that any kind of inferences that you make, any conclusions that you draw, they refer to this broader base population. And a sample is usually, if we're working quantitatively, but also if you're doing interviews or focus groups, your sample is going to be informed by this population parameter. And so even for those of you who are working with, say, self-reported consumer data or selective responses to surveys, you're going to want to think not just about the people who responded, but this broader population of potential customers or people who are in your broader public. Random sampling is often used in statistics to create a representative sample. And so what that means is simply if we want to know everything about everyone in my community here in Cambridge, we're going to try to randomly sample the households or randomly sample all of the people. But we sometimes need additional strategies to capture minority groups or marginalized populations. And this is really contingent on knowing that they exist and having a general sense of how big they are or where they might be. And so if I did a door-to-door survey here in Cambridge and I randomly selected which houses and apartments were going to be included, I was mindful of the fact that we have relatively high density of population. So I didn't want to just knock on each building, but I wanted to think about how many households live in a building. I would still have to sort of take specific strategies if I wanted to capture the unhoused population here in Cambridge. So that's how we might think about random sampling, but also targeted questions about the broader population. So the key principle here is defining the population determines where and how equity can be observed and along what lines. And what I mean by this more specifically, how we do it is we have to think about whether we're willing and able to collect information on the categories that we think matter, or whether we think that those categories might be too sensitive, too risky, or politically unacceptable. And so more broadly, to use this kind of Cambridge model for a moment, I want to acknowledge that there are certain types of information that can be really sensitive to collect, even in your community, even if it's something that you think is really important from a policy perspective. And this also applies particularly intra-organizationally. We don't always want to have a sort of lack of respect for privacy, right? So in a public context in the United States, it's really sensitive to ask questions about criminal behavior. It's really sensitive to ask questions about risky practices, such as intravenous drug use. It's really sensitive to ask about documentation status. All of these things can expose people to policing, surveillance, or interventions that might be totally unrelated to the services or care that we want to provide or the inequity issues we want to understand. On the flip side, in an organization, you may not want to ask things about marital status or sexuality or even the number of dependents that people have if it violates some of your internal organizational policies and practices. So there can be limits on how we know our population, but if we don't ask about those things, then we can't study inequalities that are directly related to them. So some of the solutions for defining your population, do think about the whole population in which you want to improve equity, right? So if I was only focused on a subpopulation where I thought there was a problem, I might miss the broader perspective. Say I was only focused on the unhoused population, to go back to my earlier example here in Cambridge, I might miss all of the people who are currently housed but at risk of eviction, or I might miss all of the people who are housed but have previously been unhoused. I also might not understand just how secure the wealthy are in their homes or how many people own multiple homes. And so think in that sort of broader perspective, rather than just thinking sort of under the microscope of where you think the problem is. The other thing that's really important is to gather data in multiple categories of difference. And we'll come to this again in just a minute, but we really want to make sure that we don't just have sort of one narrow slice of data, but that our data is rich enough that we're able to make inferences about that whole population. And so, Teddy, do you have suggestions for how we can think about kind of making inferences about the whole population when it's so dynamic and heterogeneous?
Well, that actually, I think, lends itself pretty well to sort of our next principle, which is when we have data, when we have a population that we care about, it's tempting to try to summarize them in particular ways, but thinking about the actual broader distribution is a really important and often difficult thing to do. So this next principle of examining your distribution is sort of focused on, when we say distribution, for what it's worth, we're referring to all the observed values that we have in a particular data set, how often people fall into particular categories of income or identity or things along those lines. And we tend to naturally, when we think about distributions, to think about them as a bell curve, as what we call a normal distribution. But in practice, they can be skewed very much, high or low. So income is a great example. Income is not distributed normally anywhere. There is extremely, extremely high values that basically skew everything upwards. So the key principle that I want us to think about, and this might seem as sort of stats 101, but I think it has a lot of really important implications for questions of equity and inequality, thinking about which statistics tell you what you need to know and which statistics are necessarily obscuring other things is a really important and difficult question. Because the idea here is that any number we use, for example, an average, any number we use is collapsing all the data that we have into a single metric. And by doing so, we're learning something. So for an average, we're learning about the central tendency of our data, but we're obscuring other things. We're obscuring things about the ends of the data or the spread of the data or how shares are sort of allocated across the data. And so I want to sort of show an example. Here's income in the US from 1967 to 2013, and here's the average value. If you were to look at this, you would say, okay, the average income per capita in 2013 US dollars seems to be increasing by some amount. But if we start to break this down by percentiles, which is the thing that I think we think of a lot, and let's do quintiles in this case, so dividing it into 5 parts, the lowest quintile has really not shifted very much at all over this entire period. And the second quintile hasn't shifted very much either. The third quintile may be a little bit more than that. The fourth quintile is closer to the mean, but when we start thinking about the fifth quintile, we actually have to zoom out to be able to even include them in this graph. And if we instead look at the very, very top, the top 5% of the distribution, that is sort of a huge driver to what we consider to be the increase in average income over this period of time. And so this is a very good example of the mean sort of obscuring the broader narrative, I think, about how the distribution is shifting and spreading over the course of this period. Now, this fact about things getting more unequal over time, I think, is known to a lot of people. But when we think about things in your organization, in your population, in your country, in your city, think about how those particular statistics might manifest and how they might obscure certain things while bringing to light other things. So here's sort of a distribution of income of all households in the US in 2013. And I'm going to kind of talk through a couple of statistics and metrics that you might be familiar with just in your work and how they kind of matter in terms of differing from one another. So I think the most standard thing that we might see is the mean, right? The average value, it's the most common statistic. But as we'll see, and I think we've seen a lot in terms of how income data is summarized these days, the median might actually be more representative of what we think of. When we think of mean, we usually think of the average person, but really it's the average income. And as we know, the average can be very, very skewed by very, very high values, by outliers. And so the median actually is probably a more useful summary of what we consider an average person, in that they're at the center of the distribution. So medians are not subject to outliers, and there may be better metrics for how things are actually centrally placed. We might instead care about percentiles, which is to say particular points in the distribution. If I care about the top 10% of earners, I might care about the 90th percentile. And similarly, if I care about the bottom 10%, I should care about the 10th percentile. So thinking about, do I care about averages in my work, or do I care about particular percentile values? Even those percentiles are just individual points on the distribution. We might instead care about spread. So one way of measuring spread is called the interquartile range, which is the 25th to 75th percentile, or broader than that is the 90-10 differential, which is the 10th to 90th. I don't want you to worry too much about these distinctions, but the basic idea is you might actually care about quantifying things in terms of range, in terms of spread, rather than central tendency, depending on the value or the focus of your organization. And then an additional one that's not even really present in this graph is the notion of share. So share, when we think of share, we think of the top, for example, 5% of earners. What percent of the income of the entire US is comprised by those top 5%? In this case, is 22% of income. So thinking about shares as well might matter. So the kind of big takeaway here is, what does each measure tell you and what does it obscure? And realizing that every metric you use will necessarily tell you something and obscure other things. So for solutions, I think thinking about multiple statistics for a particular outcome, not just relying on a single one, to better understand what's actually going on in your data. For example, think about what you want to characterize. Is it the center of it? Is it a place in the distribution or a threshold? Is it the spread? Is it the extent of inequality? And what characteristics matter for your particular work? Realizing that often we'll get things in averages, and knowing that you might need to actually ask for additional information on things like spread, for example, can be really, really important and a difficult thing to do. So it's something that I think we can focus on more. Zoe, any thoughts before we go to the next one?
No, for the sake of time, I think we should keep moving. But I do just want to stress, if you have the numbers, all of these statistics are available to you. And if you don't have the numbers, then you can think creatively with your team about how you might imagine a sort of qualitative or mixed methods alternative to getting at these ideas and concepts.
Great,
all right,
yeah.
So principle, yep.
No, go ahead,
Principle
please.
number 3. This one is probably the one that's most near and dear to my heart. And it's absolutely foundational. It's drawn from Black feminist theory, and it's to take an intersectional approach. And so I'm going to quote Kimberly Crenshaw, who sort of coined the term intersectionality, which actually just derives from gaps in the law that could only see women as white and could only see race as ungendered. And so she says intersectionality refers to the interactive effect of different forms of discrimination and disempowerment. And one thing that's important, it's a little bit nitpicking on the theory, but it refers to the discrimination and the disempowerment. It refers to how the institutions and the power systems see people, not necessarily to people's sort of inherent identities. It's not like some people have intersectionality and others don't. It's really how do systems of power work together? And we understand that in social science to be really one of the key drivers of inequality. So we want to understand what's going on under the hood, if you will. And we are interested in how power and institutions are impacting people's lives according to their unique combination of identity categories. It's really, really fraught. There's a huge range of research about this. There are lots of ways to think about whether you can even begin to quantify this. We can talk about this in future sessions. I teach a whole class on intersectionality. In fact, it's a week long. But the key principle here is that we want you to remember that inequalities interact in multiple and kind of interactive identity categories. And it's not just individual identity, but it's also things like geographic location and other features of one's environment that can be part of these forms of discrimination and disempowerment. So what we need to do is we need to examine problems using multiple dimensions, just as people in communities live with multiple dimensions. And we need to keep this dimensionality in mind, not only as we try to kind of build out our evidence base for diagnostics of describing and understanding the problem, but also in terms of how we create solutions. We want to avoid solutions that narrow the scope back to one note and lose some of the nuance that we're able to gather. So we're going to give you a sort of a real life example of this, but it's relatively limited in scope, right? So one of the things with intersectional analysis is there's almost infinite levels of nuance that you could have ultimately aimed towards, but you should at least start with the sort of basic parameters of using these different categories of identity and difference. So Teddy, why don't you show us this example you've got?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, and to Zoe's point, this is a very sort of simple and 2 or 3 dimensional example. But I think what's really interesting about it is that it is not the product of somebody misleading people or big errors in people's judgment or things like that. It really is just a failure of looking at the data through one dimension. So here is a study by the Williams Institute in 2019 that showed poverty rates by different sexual orientations and gender identities in the United States. So you can see the sample sizes down here and the proportion that are impoverished. And what's interesting here, and might be sort of unexpected to some people, is that the poverty rate for cis bisexual women and for transgender people they were both tied at the highest at 29%, which is very, very high. But it might be unexpected that cis bisexual women and transgender people had the same very high level of poverty. And you might look at this and say, okay, these are the 2 groups we should be focusing on. These are the 2 groups we should be reducing poverty in. And I think what's interesting about this is that if you dig into the data a little bit more, you see that by looking at an intersectional lens, there's actually a very different sort of type of poverty that we're talking about between these 2 groups. So if we compare cisgender bisexual women, transgender people on the national average on just 2 dimensions, we'll see this. So 67% of bisexual women in this survey were below 34, whereas the majority of transgender people were above. So the bisexual women were younger in this survey as compared to the national average as well. And then when we look at just college education, attending or graduating college, almost 2/3 of bisexual women in this sample were attending or graduated from college, whereas less than half of transgender people did. And so when we think about what we actually mean when we say poverty here, we're talking about young, educated women, potentially in a place where income mobility is a lot more possible. Finishing college, maybe you don't have a lot of debt and things along those lines, but your income potential might be quite a bit higher down the road, as opposed to the transgender population in which the age distribution is more uniform, right? So there are a lot more older folks. Their education level is more, I guess, fixed in terms of their progress in education. So we're talking about 2 very different types of people. And I think if we were trying to plan for a policy, at least I personally would be much more concerned about alleviating transgender poverty if all I saw was just these 3 pieces of data. And as Zoe said, there's so much more to think about. But even here, we can see that a particular statistic might be a bit misleading unless we take this intersectional approach. So even just from a quantitative perspective, I think thinking about multiple identity categories as data and really kind of crossing and cutting your data to be able to see how different identities seem to manifest for your particular outcome, and thinking about whether your outcome, in this case poverty, might actually be qualitatively different depending on who you are, where you are, your characteristics, and things along those lines. And so in addition to really thinking about what kinds of factors and variables to care about, I really think a qualitative approach can be really useful in here as well. So Zoe, do you have any thoughts on that, particularly given all of your expertise in this?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think it can be hard to kind of anticipate what categories matter when it comes to intersectional research. And so taking an intersectional approach is as much about thinking and being mindful of the ways that other categories and differences might be playing out as it is sort of, anticipating or preordaining which categories matter.
Great.
Right.
So I think one a rejoinder to what we've just said is, sure, we should look at lots of variables, but what do we do if we don't actually have the data?
Yes. So principle number 4, this is the 4th out of 5, we're getting there, is mind the data gap. So historically, data has been collected on things that are valued and understood as universal. And what this means is that there are usually default categories in every society that individuals are imagined to be. And this means that in research, for example, there's been the sort of assumption that the male body tells us more or less everything that we need to know, except for, perhaps pregnancy. And so medical research for years was built on male subjects and male patients. There are also gender stereotypes in marketing where people are, studied according to their gender identity. And there's the assumption that there's not a huge middle of people who might cross over and be interested in different products if they didn't have gendered marketing. And then I also want to just mention that, censuses originated as a tool for taxation. So there was no incentive to count people who were poor or people who moved or people who were unhoused. And so, there are sort of reasons related to power, which we were just talking about with intersectionality, that help to understand why we have data about some things and not data about other things. And so the people who have been marginalized, excluded, or disempowered are usually the ones who are most invisibilized in the data that we have at our disposal. That's the sort of first thing to know. And this is a function of the exact problems that today we're interested in having a conversation about solving. So the key principle for you to think about is to know the sources of your data. And then in relation to those sources of data, identify missing data. They may be related to the source of the data or the incentives for collecting information about the community, but they may also be sort of unrelated. They may be driven by other factors. And so some of the things to keep in mind here: be wary of what looks like an abundance of data, because you may be so excited to get into this new data set that you forget what's missing. This has sort of happened with big data, where we have huge aggregations of data about particular kinds of users, but we don't have the whole population of interest, which is principle 1. The other thing to think about is data quality. Sometimes we have really high quality data on some segments of the population, but other segments of the population, particularly those that have been marginalized or who are sort of most affected by inequality, the data quality may become much more sparse. And so we want to encourage you to be ambitious in filling these data gaps, to sort of think about this problem as not something that stifles what's possible, but that really invites us to be much more intentional about who participates in data collection and who sets the agenda for data collection. And that also relates to ethics, which we'll talk about in just a second. So there's a brilliant artist and theorist named Mimi Onuoha who has developed this project called Missing Data Sets. And I love some of the ways that she kind of describes data as missing. And she's really focused on missing data sets as those data sets that are missing in spaces that are otherwise data saturated. She has this powerful quote on her GitHub page. So if you Google Mimi Onuoha missing data sets, you can find actually a crowdsourced website where you can contribute. She says, "That which we ignore reveals more than what we give our attention to. That which we ignore reveals more than what we give our attention to." And that kind of speaks to this invisibilization, right? There's another book by a woman named Caroline Criado Perez that Teddy and I both highly recommend, called Invisible Women, which looks at this specifically in the context of gender. But there are different reasons why these data sets are missing. They may be undervalued, as I mentioned, with taxation. These may not be valuable populations. The people's lives and humanity may be undervalued in society. They may be difficult to quantify. They may be difficult to collect. It can be hard to find people who move or don't have a door you can knock on. Or it may be threatening or undesirable. And it could be threatening either to the population of interest or more likely in the context of equity, threatening to those who are sort of benefited by the status quo. So there are lots of reasons why data can be missing. That's going to affect your ability to go and fill that gap, right? So we don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it being easy to just go out and fill the gap. And we also don't want to suggest that there aren't real risks for populations of interest if there are also legacies of harm related to those silences.
I think it's such an important point, and I think it also really manifests not just in missing data, but also mismeasured data. So when we think about mismeasurement, at least when I teach it in my statistics class, I say we hope that mismeasurement is consistent. So for example, if you had a scale that you weighed yourself on and it was always 5 pounds too high, you could at least compare your weight over time and still be useful. And you would hope that it would at least be correct on average, right? And so if everyone is mismeasured in a certain way, we can kind of difference that out. If there's some fluctuations, that's okay. Unfortunately, in practice, measurement error often affects marginalized groups differentially, much more severely. So here are some examples. We have lots of research evidence now that lots of physicians sort of systematically underassess the pain that African-American women experience, and so are less likely to prescribe painkillers and things along those lines, along strictly racial lines. So our ability to assess pain accurately is differential across races, and I think that has a lot of implications for how we might want to address it. Similarly, hate crime data in the US is the product of individual police departments reporting to the FBI on a voluntary basis using some kind of guidance for what a hate crime entails, but that's differential depending on the city that you're in. And so unfortunately, we have national data for hate crimes, but it's incredibly unreliable to the point that it's very difficult to assess whether there's actually a spike in hate crimes over time. And then finally, one that I think we're all quite aware of is just the systematic underreporting of sexual assault and the ways in which that underreporting or mismeasurement differentially impacts the people that are being harmed by it. So I think this all, both the notion of missing data and errors in measurement, leads us to this problem of what we call the streetlight effect. And the streetlight effect, this has been throughout history a sort of thing that's been referenced. It was actually the earliest reference that I found was in the 13th century, but here's sort of the joke that's told. Someone comes out, a police officer comes over to someone saying, "Hey, what are you looking for?" They said, "I'm looking for my quarter that I dropped." And they say, "Did you drop it here?" And they say, "No, I dropped it 2 blocks down the street." And they say, "Then why are you looking for it here?" And they say, "Well, the light is much better here, so I'm looking for it here." It's a very funny joke. Everyone laughs. But it actually has a lot of really important implications for how we think about things for data, right? We want to be data driven, but a risk is that we use the data that we have access to, and we have a tendency to equate what we observe with what is true, right? So we'll naturally gravitate toward data that's available to us, which will necessarily, well, not necessarily, which will often end up excluding groups that really matter or mismeasuring groups that really matter. And so thinking about how this tendency, this streetlight effect, can be mitigated through the kinds of actions that everyone on this webinar is interested in doing is a really important implication for how we actually address issues of inequality. So Zoe, what do we do about this data gap?
I'm so glad you asked. Well, I think, one thing is we really want to encourage everyone to start with qualitative data and narrative testimony. This is one of the biggest frustrations of communities that have been overlooked, marginalized, or excluded, is that they are not silent. These sort of experiences of inequality, experiences of the systems of power have been documented, but they haven't always been documented in the same ways that are legible to policymakers or those who are interested in kind of quantifying the gaps, right? And so one thing is to just always begin with what is in fact already there. And sometimes that means you have to get someone who can help you read it in another language. Sometimes it means you're going to need to go to the community and talk to people. This sort of complex engagement, I think, will only enhance what's otherwise being done with a kind of quantitative lens. Second, do collect new data, right? Make that new data publicly available if it's safe to do so. And if the participants and those who give you the data are willing to be part of that broader process, de-identify it so that it's safe for everyone, but collect new data in ethical ways and share it so that we, begin reducing the number of missing data sets on Mimi Onuoha's page. And then finally, think about collecting data on small and missing populations in slightly more targeted ways. So there are lots of strategies, sampling strategies to deal with this from a sort of technical perspective. But what it means is you really want to be intentional about who's likely to be overlooked by a broader kind of population approach. Do the population approach, but then go in and try to target those populations that are smaller in ways that are respectful of their status and their potential vulnerability within the community. And then finally, as we've kind of touched on a couple of times, work with the communities who are most affected to make informed and ethical data collection strategies, but also to set a knowledge agenda in a way that really respects what we already know from human history, lived experience, and kind of broader sources of information.
Wonderful. So we have one principle left. I think we're going to go a little bit into our Q&A time, but I think this is an important enough one that we should spend the time doing it. So Zoe, what do we mean by defining equity and success?
Yeah, so we really have to be careful when we think about equity and success. This relates back to that very first kind of slide of definitions of equity versus equality, thinking about how we measure the right form of equality. So sometimes you have equal numbers, 5 and 5, as you'll see in just a minute, but these are not proportional to a population. Maybe the proportion of the population isn't representative of the actual experience of a problem, or maybe processes that we're interested in redressing have unequal treatment built into them before we get to the point of observation. So if that doesn't make sense, we'll go through it one more time, but there's usually a pipeline effect that gets people to the sort of place that we have interest in creating more equity. We don't always have influence over the rest of the pipeline. And so we need to think carefully about, what are our targets? What are we imagining success to look like, but also how are we measuring equity along the way? So that's thinking about the kind of the right outcome, as well as thinking about the process to get there. I want you to remember that just because things look equal, that doesn't mean that they're meeting our goals for good and equitable outcomes. So equality in doesn't always lead to equity out, which can be a little bit kind of hard to wrap our minds around, but hopefully with a few examples, you'll get a sense of what we're talking about. And then we want you to sort of think carefully about where and how inequalities can appear or hide in that complex process. So where in that pipeline might there be inequalities baked in so that when it gets to you, it looks like you're doing a pretty good job, right? Choose equity measures that are consistent with your goals. And we hope that you'll choose goals that are transformative, so that seek to kind of shape the process of what comes in, and not only just sort of meet minimum standards for equity today, but really think about equity for the future.
So I wanted to go through an example.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've got an illustration of this, right?
Yeah. So this is I think a pretty problematic example of equity or lack of disparity being defined essentially wrong. So I'm going to reference now a paper that was published in a very prestigious forum, but was actually later retracted because it defined equity and defined lack of disparity poorly. So this is a paper on officer characteristics in the US and racial disparities in killing of civilians by officers. And the takeaway from this article, which, as I said, has been retracted, was that there was no evidence of anti-Black or anti-Hispanic disparities across shootings. So let's think about now how they defined lack of disparity and why it's so problematic. So success in this article was defined as if the percent of civilians who are killed by officers who are white is roughly equal to the percent of civilians killed who are Black, then there is no racial disparity in fatal police shootings. So if of people who are killed by police officers, if the same number are white versus Black, then there's no disparity. So let's illustrate what's wrong with this metric, and we're going to do so in the case of arrests. So I'm pivoting from killings to arrests just for the sake of not having us imagine more death and police motivated killings. We're going to focus instead on arrest rates to sort of illustrate what's wrong with this metric. So imagine 10 people are arrested, 5 are white and 5 are Black. Then according to the metrics of this paper, if 50% of those arrested are white, 5 of them are white, it's the same as the percent of who are arrested who are Black, 50%. So there's actually no racial disparity in police arrests according to this metric in this, again, hypothetical example. But here's why that metric is so problematic. Let's imagine a city. There are many cities in America like this. I think Seattle, where Zoe hails from, is like this in terms of distribution of race across the population. Imagine that police encounter 100 people, and it's a predominantly white city. So 90 of those people are white and only 10 are Black. And as we said before, 10 people are arrested, 5 are white and 5 are Black. So according to this metric of lack of disparity, this is a perfectly fine result because 50% of the people who are arrested were white versus Black. The problem is, if we actually contextualize this in terms of the broader population, so by which I mean using the denominator of the actual number of people encountering police officers, that 5 and 5 is actually extremely inequitable. There's extreme disparity in arrests, because 5 of those white people who were arrested comes from 90 who encountered police. So that's actually a 5.5% arrest rate, whereas those 5 Black people who were arrested were part of only 10 officer encounters with Black people. So 50% of those fictional encounters were with Black civilians led to arrest. So we can see how incredibly problematic this can be in practice when we actually think about what this looks like for the underlying population that we care about. So in statistics, we call this notion of defining a particular outcome without taking into account the broader context, in this case, the encounter rate with police officers or even the broader population distribution. We call it base rate neglect. It's all over the place. This paper was sort of found to have violated that and ended up actually being fully retracted by the authors as a result. An alternative metric you might think about is, does breakdown by race in terms of arrests align with the underlying population breakdown along race? That might be one way of measuring equity, and we can argue about different ways of defining that well, but I would think that this would be much better than the one that the authors originally used. The problem with defining success in this case is, even if I said the arrest rate should be proportional to the number of people in the population, maybe the goal actually should be 0. In the context of the paper, it was for killings by police officers. Maybe the goal should be 0, not equity. So thinking about not equivalence, sorry. So thinking about what success means and what equity means in a particular context is incredibly important, because it leads us as organizations to optimize in different ways that can be quite problematic. So Zoe, how does this relate then to maybe defining success more generally? You have another example related to gender.
Yeah, I wanted to get into this idea of the pipeline, and I'll try to be brief so that we have as much time as possible for the discussion. But the World Economic Forum found that it's going to take 100 years to achieve multidimensional gender parity. So in the spirit of kind of disaggregation and going beyond just what we sort of see at the overall mean or the overall population, in economic participation and opportunity specifically, it's actually going to take 257 years. And so there are different dimensions on which equality may be moving more or less slowly. So that's one thing just to kind of remind us of. But I think in terms of how we think about what does gender equity look like, how would we think about gender equitable success, I want to stress that part of this story will always have to be about intersectional equity. So not just thinking about women and men, but also thinking about people with different gender identities, whether they're transgender, non-binary, or have other identities, thinking about racial equity within gender equity. And then along that line, we're going to probably observe what's a slow burn. And so even if we see this sort of increase over time in the participation of women and non-male kind of participants in the economy, we're going to see that it's going to be basically a long deferred success rate. And so there are different ways of thinking about your sort of strategies or solutions for achieving equity. And all of them may look like equity-oriented solutions. So one is to have a hiring rate. I'm going to kind of take us out of the global, right, and try to get it into the realm of something that a lot of you might have power over, which is maybe you're able to participate in or at least have input towards hiring decisions within your community, within your organization, institution, et cetera. So a hiring rate proportionate to the applicant pool means that you want to make sure that you're hiring people respective to kind of the identities that are distributed within the applicants to your organization. Another way that you might think about it is, well, we don't know if the applicant pool is always going to be very kind of diverse or inclusive. And so we want to at least hire at a replacement rate. Both of these basically maintain the status quo in different ways. One is by relying on the applicant pool to change rather than kind of forcing your organization to change. Often the applicant pool is going to reflect all the inequalities that exist in advance of the opportunity to apply for a position. And then hiring at the replacement rate, it really just maintains the status quo. But in terms of thinking about other versions of success, you might think about, well, we want to hire proportional to the population as a whole. And so that would be, we want to hire, a gender representative pool of people over the next 5 to 10 years. And so in the next 5 to 10 years, those who come in are going to kind of be more gender equitable. Now, this hinges on people aging out of the organization or at least having turnover. If you want to actually accelerate the rate at which you get to gender equity, then you're going to need to actually try to work harder towards equity. And so that would maybe involve creating more positions than you would otherwise have so that you can expand the number of people with different kind of identity categories or dimensions of skills that are represented. You also might pursue something like hiring in clusters or over recruiting in particular categories. I'm using the example of recruitment because I think it's one that's so personal and familiar for so many of us in a professional space. But if you think about service delivery, if you think about other kind of distributional policies around public goods, you can flip it and think in terms of how are we doing our outreach? Are we just reaching out to those who are already receiving our services and hoping that we're equitable along the way? Or are we really doing this sort of alternative approach of clustered or expanded targeting of historically excluded or underrepresented populations?
Wonderful. So the closing thought or just about this last principle is simply to think very carefully about your metrics for success. Realize that once you define a metric, it has a lot of implications for how individual people function. In fact, we should be careful, I think, about turning one metric into the purpose of you or your organization. There's a saying attributed to Goodhart's law: when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. By which we mean, if we decide that the goal is to turn this disparity to zero, for example, in gender breakdown of our organization, we may do so at the expense of other things, for example, such as racial equity or sexual identity and things along those lines. We should think about a particular metric not being sufficient to characterize the problem. And if it's not sufficient to characterize the problem, it's not sufficient to characterize the solution. So we should think very carefully about what success means to us and what we should be mindful of when we decide that, for example, maybe our priorities or maybe the landscape changes in some ways that requires us to iterate in some way. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm just going to list these 5 principles here. I'm excited to hear everyone's questions, but I wanted to say, as we said, this is just a high-level look at some of the topics and some of the concerns that I think are really important and that Zoe does as well. If this is of interest to you to learn more about, please make sure to respond to the survey that gets sent out about interest in further work on this, because that has a lot of implications for what we end up spending our time on as faculty and as the Kennedy School. So with that, questions. Charlotte, do you want to maybe surface some questions for us to answer?
Absolutely. There is an overwhelming and amazing amount of great questions in the chat. So let's get to as many as we can. I'm going to dive in with 2 categories of questions that also came up in the pre-survey. Thanks to those who answered it. So the first is around measurement and data collection when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in hiring. So we've got someone asking about individuals who may not feel comfortable identifying at certain different, identities at different intersections, for example, being BIPOC. How would you capture data on hiring, retention, career development for these individuals so that you're actually getting an accurate picture of what your organization is doing for hiring? And then I'll read another just in case it increases the chance that we get to a couple. The second big category we saw in the pre-survey too was COVID-19. And so if you have a chance, it'd be great if you can touch on how you see issues of equity and data collection arising as a result of the pandemic. Thinking about working, for example, in international education policy, and there's just a host of challenges there to assess quality of remote education, engaging with distance learning, et cetera.
Those are wonderful questions. Zoe, do you want to start with collecting data on things like hiring?
Yeah, and Charlotte, was the question really about, legal restrictions? I wasn't sure if I got the nuance on it.
I don't think it was, but I'm sure that's an area that's relevant to touch on, although I know we have a really international audience, but I think it's getting at when you're relying on things like self-reported data, what are some other metrics you can use?
Yeah, this is huge. So I think self-reported data is interesting because it tells us a lot about society. It doesn't always tell us a ton about the kind of like interior and objective reality. So I'll just give one tiny example. Self-reported data on empathy has been used to understand that women have much higher levels of empathy than men. But when neuroscientists started actually doing brain scans, they found that there wasn't actually a gender or biological difference in terms of empathy. It's just that women have been so socialized to express that they're empathetic as they actually responded to researchers in as agnostic a setting as possible, according to that kind of socialization practice. When it comes to sensitive data, there are a whole host of other reasons why people may not want to share or disclose things, particularly to an employer. So I think it's too big of a topic for us to really get into all of the challenges that we face when you have the power of employment over data collection. But I would just stress that I think in all equity work, the top priority needs to be serving the experience and quality of kind of protection within a community for those who are most marginalized by it. And so the objective should never prioritize data gathering or data collection over the rights and integrity and dignity and privacy of people who have historically been excluded and marginalized. And so in that case, self-reporting can be a really good tool because you allow people to share as much as they want. I think one of the strategies that I would suggest is look at broaden your population. So don't just think about your own organization, but think about all of the actors that have similar characteristics to your organization. So it may be all city governments in the state, it may be all city governments of an equivalent size in the country, it may be all NGOs. And if you're able to get kind of comparator data, even with self-reported data, it can begin to give you a sense of, are we falling behind? Who's doing this well? What are some of the best practices? And so thinking comparatively can sometimes give us an advantage when we're trying to strike that balance of sort of ethics and privacy, and then also the challenges with self-reports.
There's one thing I'll add to that. Yeah, I mean, I think you really characterized it. One thing I'll add to that is I think there's a tendency to respond to somebody not wanting to share, for example, their sexual identity but we're just trying to help. We're like using this to hire more people, or we're using this to provide resources or things along those lines. And I think the institutional skepticism should be taken seriously and not just sort of dismissed as people not knowing what's best for them. So I think a lot of the concerns that I've encountered at the Kennedy School, for example, in trying to ask folks how they identify in different ways is not quite knowing what it's being used for. And I know it's common to think that, oh, we should just ask once and then we'll have this database and we can use that database to learn everything that we need, but rather making very explicit every time why you're asking for a piece of data and whether or not somebody consents to sharing it for that particular purpose does add a lot of legwork and does add a lot of paperwork. But I think it really helps to make sure that folks' privacy and preferences are being respected when collecting data about them.
Yeah, and on the question about COVID-19, I think, it's a huge issue. Basically, COVID-19 has, as all of you have heard, really exposed pre-existing inequalities and structural inequalities, and it's made a lot of gaps much larger, including the sort of gender gap that we talked about. I think one of the things in terms of data collection and accessing information about some of these exacerbated inequalities, it's been promising to see just how nimble and creative people have been in trying to do socially distanced data collection and research and trying to kind of think in new ways about how do we find out about hidden populations. And so I won't get into the examples for the sake of time, but there's a silver lining in terms of thinking much more rigorously about how do we tap into the rural population? How do we tap into the safety of people in their homes if they live in abusive relationships and can't access public services? How do we think about these things that have otherwise been hidden? And so part of what I hope comes out of the long and extended pandemic experience is that we continue to apply those best practices and don't just think of them in crisis response.
That's great. Charlotte?
Thank you both so much. So again, we have so many questions. I do see that we have one live question. So I'd like to go ahead and invite that person to unmute and ask your question out loud.
Great. Hi, Robin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, yeah, hi. I also put my question in writing, but so this is my quandary, having been involved in DEI work in the context of the labor movement for over 30 years. These are not new topics. We know that. They have different names. Intersectionality, of course, is a common one, and I love Kim Crenshaw's work. I guess my frustration with this discussion or the focus of data-driven stuff, which I think, of course, is important, is how are we using that to impact real social change at a grassroots level? You know, how are we dealing with, how is data useful in terms of changing the relationships of power in, let's just say a large corporation, in a manufacturing plant, in a meatpacking plant where COVID is rampant and we have no health and safety protections and we have no equity around wages or wage parity or anything, at that level of seriousness. So my question, I guess, is related to how do we use better, more well-informed data collected by people who are committed to altering relations of power in real life, let's just say organizing workers to, live and work in a more safe and equitable place. I mean, how do we make this concrete is where I'm going.
That's a wonderful question. Zoe, do you want to start or should I start?
You should start. And I really appreciate the question, Robin. So I'm sure I'll have 2 cents to add.
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Fantastic question, Robin. And also thank you for all the work that you've done on organizing. That sounds incredibly important. My short answer and the quick thing I'll say is I do not want people to take away from this that data is the solution to everything. I think there are situations where, and lots of situations where, the extent of a problem is so deep and present and known that the notion of collecting better data or looking at it from different angles or things like that might be a secondary or even tertiary concern compared to the very real act of organizing, protesting, doing the kind of work to actually shift around power in a way that leads to actual action. That said, I do think that the notion of getting data that is characterizing things correctly can be useful in 2 ways. One is, I think statistics are a language, just like English is a language, and being able to speak it well, I think, can motivate people and move people in ways just like a really great orator can move people and change things. So I think knowing that data well to actually move people is very important. And secondly, if it is a really complex question, if there really are multiple things at play, having that data will let you, particularly organizations that are really cash strapped, use their resources as effectively as possible to make sure that they're accomplishing what they want to accomplish without sacrificing, other important ones. So I certainly don't want to act like your question is not immensely important and absolutely central, but I do think there are certainly situations where data can be helpful, both for mobilizing and for planning. Zoe, what do you think?
Yeah, I would just add, evidence is not a substitute. And this is how I kind of hear your question, Robin, and what well, but what I want to share and uplift for the audience. Evidence is not a substitute for rights and protections, right? The rights and protections that are there are the entitlements that people have to safety, security, liberty, bodily autonomy. That the way that we want to use evidence and encourage you all to deploy it is to really kind of hold power brokers' feet to the fire on like where the gaps are and where people are falling short. And there's a lot of organizing and advocacy that can be done without evidence, but also with narrative evidence, with lived experience. And I think that especially in the context of, say, meatpacking during COVID, we don't have time to find out all the rates of transmission. That assumes that there's transmission that we've allowed to happen in order to be convinced of a problem, when we could just talk to people about their working conditions. And so that is also like necessary and essential evidence. And part of what I think Teddy and I would like to do is continue these conversations and workshops about how you might package some of that as evidence, not just as a kind of calling card of what we need, but here's the evidence to demonstrate it. And so I would just say, this evidence can be used in sort of a mixed method context to diagnose the problem. If you already know the problem, it can be used to convince those who have the power to do things differently that it's necessary. It can be used to convince an external audience to have leverage over those power brokers who are otherwise ambivalent or sort of saying they're doing enough. And then it can also be used, as Teddy alluded, to really specify the nature of the problem, where things are falling short, where things are falling between the gaps, and then create targets and tracking so that we can build that bottom-up accountability that is really quite challenging if we know that these are populations whose stories and organizing have been devalued and disempowered, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Charlotte, are we up on time?
So we are at time. If we have one more minute, I maybe just want to surface the fact that we've gotten several questions in the chat that are a little more focused on data collection and analysis. So one individual asked about how large of a sample size you need. We've got someone else asking about what you do once you have data. Then you enter it into software, and then what if the software itself had some inherent bias, and what to do when your analysis itself is biased. So if you have time maybe to talk about how large of topics those are and how much we could potentially address those in the future, that would be great. And then we can turn it back to Erica to wrap up.
Sure. So I'll speak very, very briefly about this. The main thing I'll say is that each of those topics There's so much for us to discuss about it. So if it is of interest to further delve into these topics, again, please do respond to that survey so that we have an indication that there's more appetite for this kind of work. To the question of sample size, the thing I'll say, and Zoe sort of alluded to this, is that we're sort of used to, when we do surveys and things, to just try to randomly sample the population and kind of get a subset of them. If we do that, it is very common for marginalized groups or groups that are not well represented in the population to essentially have a very, very small sample size of those people so that we can't actually learn very much about that particular subpopulation. And so this notion of oversampling groups that we actually care about, and then later down the road, we can correct it to make sure that we're representative and all of that, but making sure that we're oversampling to make sure that we have enough individuals to be able to learn about particular subsets of the population is a topic that I'd love to get into more. I just have to make that plug because I like talking about it so much. But Zoe, anything from you?
No, I think just for the sake of time, I want to share, a final thought, which is that I really look forward to reading the 60 questions that we didn't get to. And I'm so grateful to all of you who are here, particularly the 40% of you who really work on equity sort of day in and day out as either your day job or your passion project. We'd love to be in conversation with you. We welcome resources and feedback. Teddy and I are hoping that this can be part of a much broader initiative. And, the Kennedy School has a number of world-leading faculty who are trying to crack some of these difficult problems. The last thing I just wanted to stress, Robin inspired it with her question in terms of thinking as an advocate, is you don't just need to think about evidence in terms of like getting a declining rate on a problem. You can really be bold and ambitious. When I worked at the UN, I was there when they launched the Getting to Zero campaign for HIV/AIDS transmission. And the goal was not to reduce HIV/AIDS transmission. The goal was to have zero transmission. And I think that type of radical thinking is very kind of salient when we think about evidence and we think about the relationship between evidence and incrementalism versus evidence and radical transformation.
Great. Thank you all so much. This was really fantastic. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for submitting your questions. And we're sorry we can get to all of them. We will be sending the recording and a follow-up survey to you all in the coming days. We hope you'll take a moment to share your feedback. We also hope you'll join us for others in the webcast series, including our next webcast on November 17th, which is Challenges in Higher Education with our own Dean, Doug Elmendorf. We posted a registration link in the chat and we hope to see you there. Thank you all again. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Teddy. And we hope to see you soon. Be well, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.